In the utterly devastating, highly chaotic, and geopolitically fractured immediate aftermath of the catastrophic destruction of the Zagros Mountains subterranean nuclear complex, the surviving, deeply radicalized remnants of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps realized with chilling absolute certainty that their ultimate strategic deterrent had been permanently and violently erased from the global chessboard. Stripped of their supreme theocratic leadership, their advanced electronic warfare domes utterly pulverized into smoking slag, and their heavily fortified, multi-billion-dollar nuclear ambitions irrevocably buried under millions of tons of crushed, highly irradiated granite, a rogue, uncompromising, and deeply fanatical faction of hardline military generals initiated their absolute final, apocalyptic contingency plan. Hidden deep within the labyrinthine, seemingly innocuous, and heavily reinforced civilian subway tunnels far beneath the sprawling, densely populated metropolis of Tehran, massive, heavily camouflaged mobile transporter erector launchers were aggressively and silently rolled into pre-calculated firing positions under the terrifying cover of a massive, artificially induced, citywide electrical blackout designed to temporarily blind overhead Western optical satellites. Their payload was absolutely not the conventional, easily trackable ballistic weaponry of the previous decade, nor was it the relatively slow, easily interceptable cruise missiles that had been completely neutralized in earlier skirmishes. These immense dark cylinders housed the highly classified, drastically upgraded, and previously unseen variants of the Fatah II hypersonic glide vehicles, incredibly advanced, physics-defying weapons capable of accelerating to terrifying terminal speeds exceeding Mach 15 while executing violent, highly unpredictable, computer-controlled atmospheric maneuvers explicitly designed to completely defeat, confuse, and overwhelm the most advanced modern Western air defense networks ever constructed. The target designated in their heavily encrypted targeting computers was unequivocally clear, deeply symbolic, and terrifyingly strategic. The United States Navy's USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, a colossal nuclear-powered floating fortress, currently projecting overwhelming, undisputed American military hegemony from the turbulent, dark, and highly contested waters of the Arabian Sea. For the desperate IRGC High Command, this was absolutely no longer a calculated, proportional military engagement designed to achieve a negotiated diplomatic or political settlement. It was a pure, suicidal act of absolute, unadulterated vengeance intended to send a $10 billion American supercarrier and its 5,000 elite sailors straight to the dark bottom of the ocean, effectively dragging the entire industrialized globe into an unprecedented, uncontrollable, and highly radioactive Third World War. High above the Earth's atmosphere, the Pentagon's Space-Based Infrared System, SBIRS constellation, operating flawlessly in geosynchronous orbit, instantly detected the massive, unmistakable, and terrifyingly bright thermal blooming of the solid rocket boosters igniting perfectly in unison deep within the Iranian capital. The terrifying flashing red early warning alerts immediately flooded into the deeply secured, heavily guarded combat information centers across the entire United States military apparatus, from CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa to the deeply buried bunkers under the Pentagon, instantly confirming the absolute worst-case geopolitical scenario imaginable. A highly coordinated, multi-vector hypersonic decapitation strike against the undisputed crown jewel of the American naval fleet had officially been launched, and the incredibly tight, unforgiving, and mathematically terrifying window for successful interception was rapidly, violently closing to a matter of mere agonizing minutes. The fundamental, terrifying physics of successfully defending against a highly coordinated, multi-axis hypersonic glide vehicle swarm is exactly the nightmare scenario that keeps the brightest, most experienced tactical minds and aerospace engineers at the Pentagon awake in cold, shivering sweats. Unlike traditional legacy intercontinental ballistic missiles that predictably follow a highly calculated, rigid, and mathematically solvable parabolic arch through the cold, frictionless vacuum of deep space before falling back to Earth, these incredibly advanced Iranian hypersonic weapons aggressively re-enter the Earth's upper atmosphere relatively early in their terrifying flight path. Once securely inside the dense atmosphere, they ruthlessly utilize incredibly complex, highly classified aerodynamic lift surfaces to physically surf the extremely volatile boundary layer at the very edge of space, executing violent, high-G lateral corkscrews and sudden, unpredictable altitude drop maneuvers that constantly, fundamentally alter their projected computer-estimated trajectory. This absolutely unpredictable snake-like flight path renders standard mathematically driven defensive interception algorithms completely and utterly useless, as the target is simply never where the radar calculates it will be a fraction of a second later. However, executing such highly complex, violently aggressive atmospheric gymnastics at unimaginable speeds exceeding 10,000 miles per hour absolutely requires continuous, flawlessly encrypted, real-time mid-course telemetry and targeting updates from external sources to prevent the incredibly fragile missiles from violently tearing themselves apart under aerodynamic stress or completely losing their target lock due to the blinding, superheated plasma sheath that naturally forms around their composite nose cones, effectively blinding their internal senses. United States Space Command. working in absolute frantic and unprecedented synchronization with the elite, highly secretive digital cryptologic warriors of the National Security Agency operating out of the massive Utah data center, quickly discovered an incredibly chilling, highly sophisticated anomaly cleverly hidden within the chaotic, overloaded electromagnetic spectrum of the Middle East. The incoming Iranian hypersonic missiles were absolutely not relying on their own crippled, severely damaged domestic ground-based radar networks for vital mid-course guidance. Instead, they were secretly, illicitly, and brilliantly piggybacking off a compromised, supposedly entirely neutral commercial Ku-band telecommunications satellite constellation currently passing perfectly directly overhead in low Earth orbit. The rogue, technologically sophisticated IRGC faction had successfully managed to aggressively spoof the civilian commercial network's encryption protocols, effectively hijacking innocent, privately owned orbital infrastructure to act as the vital, high-speed digital umbilical cord guiding their apocalyptic, world-ending weapons directly toward the American fleet. The sudden, horrifying realization sent a paralyzing shockwave of sheer terror through the United States military command structure. They were completely, technologically blind to the exact incoming trajectory of the swarm. And unless they could immediately, surgically, and digitally sever that specific hijacked orbital data link, the hypersonic missiles would flawlessly adjust their terrifying descent, completely bypassing the fleet's multi-billion-dollar outer defensive rings and slamming directly into the highly populated flight deck of the supercarrier with absolute, unstoppable, earth-shattering kinetic devastation. Aboard the massive USS Gerald R. surrounded entirely by the pitch-black, churning, and highly unpredictable waters of the Arabian Sea, the atmosphere inside the heavily armored, deeply buried Combat Information Center instantly transformed into a terrifying scene of absolute, tightly controlled, and highly disciplined military chaos. The Carrier Strike Group commander, a seasoned veteran staring intently at the massive, glowing holographic Aegis tactical displays that were currently terrifyingly failing to accurately predict the radically shifting incoming threat vectors, ordered the immediate, unconditional, and full-scale execution of the United States Navy's ultimate, multi-layered Aegis Baseline 9 ballistic missile defense protocols. Surrounding the massive nuclear-powered supercarrier, the formidable Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers and Ticonderoga-class cruisers aggressively angled their massive flat-paneled AN/SPY-1 radar arrays directly towards the heavens, immediately launching a massive, deafening, and highly synchronized rippling salvo of advanced SM-3 Block 2A exo-atmospheric interceptor missiles from their vertical launch system cells. These incredibly advanced, multi-million-dollar kinetic kill vehicles rocketed upwards into the freezing exosphere at blinding supersonic speeds, trailing massive columns of bright white solid rocket exhaust as they desperately tried to engage and destroy the incoming Iranian hypersonic threats in the incredibly brief, fleeting window before they dove too deep into the protective cover of the Earth's atmosphere. But the terrifying, highly advanced, computer-driven agility of the Fatah II glide vehicles proved to be absolutely, catastrophically devastating to the American defense algorithms. As the American kinetic interceptors rapidly closed the immense vertical distance, their onboard optical sensors attempting to achieve a final fatal lock, the incoming Iranian weapons violently executed aggressive, physics-defying high-G corkscrew maneuvers, perfectly dodging the incoming kinetic kill vehicles by mere agonizing hundreds of yards. The highly expensive, technologically miraculous American interceptors harmlessly and tragically detonated into useless clouds of shrapnel in the cold, silent vacuum of space, completely and utterly failing to neutralize the incoming apocalyptic threat. The horrifying, inescapable reality instantly settled like a suffocating blanket over the entire Carrier Strike Group. The traditional, heavily relied upon and astronomically expensive outer layer of the United States Navy's vaunted missile defense shield had been completely, fundamentally, and undeniably defeated by the incredible aerodynamic capabilities of the hypersonic swarm. The surviving incoming missiles aggressively breached the upper atmosphere, accelerating rapidly and glowing white-hot as they began their terrifying, highly unpredictable, and seemingly unstoppable terminal dive directly towards the highly vulnerable carrier. Deafening, high-pitched collision alarms screamed relentlessly throughout the massive, labyrinthine corridors of the ship, and 5,000 elite sailors desperately braced for an unavoidable, catastrophic kinetic impact that would inevitably trigger massive chain-reaction secondary explosions of highly volatile aviation fuel and live, heavy munitions stored on the flight deck, practically guaranteeing the total, tragic, and historically unprecedented loss of the $10 billion flagship vessel. However, the terrifying, breath-stealing ordeal was absolutely, unequivocally not over for the sailors of the American fleet. While the violent, highly successful cybernetic severing of the orbital data link had successfully caused several of the incoming, now blinded hypersonic glide vehicles to violently lose their delicate aerodynamic stability, causing them to aggressively tumble, catch the dense air at the wrong angle, and catastrophically tear themselves apart under the immense, crushing, superheated friction of the lower atmosphere. Two of the lethal, heavily armored Iranian weapons miraculously managed to maintain their physical structural integrity, completely blinded but still incredibly dangerous and carrying massive payloads of highly volatile explosives. They continued their terrifying, high-speed, steep terminal dive directly towards the massive, nuclear-powered heart of the Carrier Strike Group. Standard, highly reliable close-in weapon systems like the legendary radar-guided Phalanx CIWS, relying entirely on physically firing massive, dense clouds of depleted uranium and tungsten bullets into the air to create a wall of metal, were simply not mechanically fast enough, nor mathematically precise enough, to successfully intercept and destroy a relatively small, heavily armored target, moving erratically at 15 times the speed of sound. In an act of absolute, unprecedented tactical desperation, and with literally single-digit seconds remaining before a catastrophic deck impact, the commanding strike group admiral authorized the immediate, full-power, unrestricted activation of the United States Navy's most highly classified, previously experimental, and deeply secretive point defense asset, the high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance HELIOS system, heavily modified, secretly upgraded, and massively amplified to produce a terrifying, multi-megawatt continuous beam of concentrated, highly weaponized light. Mounted seamlessly onto the sleek superstructure of the escorting Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, massive, heavily cooled, state-of-the-art superconducting capacitors violently discharged immense, staggering amounts of raw electrical energy directly drawn from the ship's massive gas turbine engines into the advanced solid-state directed energy weapon systems. Unlike traditional kinetic missiles or bullets that take precious, highly valuable seconds to physically travel through the air to reach their targets, the highly concentrated, completely invisible laser beam travels precisely and immutably at the absolute speed of light, ensuring absolute, instantaneous, and unavoidable physical engagement the exact millisecond the advanced artificial intelligence of the fire control computer achieves a positive, mathematically perfect tracking lock on the glowing, superheated, incoming hypersonic threat. The dense, salty ocean atmosphere itself violently crackled, audibly popped, and heavily ionized as the completely invisible, overwhelmingly powerful, and terrifyingly silent beam of concentrated thermal energy silently punched straight up through the dark, turbulent, low-hanging rain clouds directly towards the two incoming, superheated, plunging warheads that were now just agonizing seconds away from creating an unprecedented, historically catastrophic naval tragedy that would alter the course of human history. The absolute geopolitical stakes had never been higher in the modern era. This was the ultimate, highly anticipated, and deeply terrifying real-world combat test of next-generation science fiction defensive technology matched directly against the absolute, bleeding-edge pinnacle of offensive hypersonic aerospace engineering, playing out in terrifying real-time over the dark, unforgiving waters of the Arabian Sea. The physical, aerodynamic results of the highly experimental, unprecedented multi-megawatt directed energy engagement were absolutely spectacular, utterly devastating, and terrifyingly instantaneous, as the overwhelmingly powerful, highly concentrated, and perfectly focused invisible laser beam perfectly intersected with the rapidly descending, glowing, incoming hypersonic glide vehicles. It absolutely did not cause a traditional, cinematic, Hollywood-style explosive detonation of the warhead. Instead, the incredible, highly focused, and relentlessly sustained thermal energy of the weaponized light rapidly, violently, and exponentially compounded with the already extreme, naturally occurring atmospheric friction that was constantly generating massive, punishing heat on the missile's incredibly aerodynamic pointed nose cones. The highly classified, incredibly durable, and highly expensive carbon composite heat shields specifically engineered to protect the lethal, highly sensitive, high-explosive warheads inside were absolutely never designed, tested, or mathematically rated to withstand this unprecedented, highly concentrated, and aggressively focused external thermal directed energy assault. In a fraction of a single, blinding millisecond, the incredibly strong, temperature-resistant aerospace materials violently boiled, aggressively melted into liquid slag, and catastrophically, structurally failed under the unbearable, tightly focused, and relentless heat of the megawatt laser. The incredibly delicate, highly sensitive internal guidance electronics and the massive, highly volatile high-explosive payloads were instantly, violently exposed directly to the incredibly destructive, physically crushing aerodynamic dynamic pressure forces of traveling at Mach 15 straight through the incredibly dense, oxygen-rich lower atmosphere. The two remaining highly feared Iranian hypersonic missiles literally disintegrated and vaporized in mid-air, violently tearing themselves apart into millions of tiny, harmless, burning, and completely neutralized fragments of molten metal and shredded composite that showered down like a spectacular, harmless meteor shower into the churning, dark, freezing waters of the Arabian Sea just a few short, agonizing miles away from the completely untouched, perfectly intact, and miraculously saved massive flight deck of the USS Gerald R. The terrifying, highly coordinated, and deeply secretive Iranian hypersonic retaliation strike, designed entirely to completely alter the global balance of power, plunge the world into economic chaos, and publicly humiliate the United States military apparatus on the world stage, had been flawlessly, comprehensively, and undeniably defeated by a breathtaking, unprecedented combination of aggressive, real-time offensive cyber warfare and completely revolutionary, speed-of-light directed energy weapons. When the golden sun finally rose over the deeply contested, highly volatile waters of the Middle East the following morning, casting a warm glow over the massive gray hulls of the American warships, the harsh geopolitical reality was absolutely, undeniably clear to every single observing nation on Earth. The United States had successfully, definitively, and publicly proven that even the most terrifying, supposedly invincible, and highly touted hypersonic weapons could be completely, surgically neutralized, cementing their absolute unchallenged technological supremacy for the next century and effectively, permanently ending the Iranian conventional military threat once and for all.